The Alpha King had to fight a whole empire to protect his loved one. over the years, how Margot's gaze would find her across the factory floor, how she would appear beside Winter's loom at irregular intervals, asking nothing, saying nothing, simply standing close enough that Winter could smell the rosewater perfume that seemed obscene in a place that stank of oil and exhaustion. And there were the letters, sealed with red wax, that Margot would write in her office overlooking the factory floor. Letters she guarded with a possessiveness that suggested they contained something far more valuable than factory business. Letters that were always dispatched by private courier rather than through the regular post. Winter's daily existence had calcified into routine so absolute it had ceased to feel like living and had become instead a series of motions her body performed without input from her mind. Wake at 5 when the bell rang through the dormitory where she slept in a narrow bed identical to 29 others. Wash face and hands in cold water from the communal basin. Dress in the gray uniform that marked her as property of Whitlock Industrial. Walk down 3 flights of stairs to the factory floor. Stand at loom number 14. Work until the lunch bell. Eat thin gruel and hard bread in the commissary. Return to loom. Work until the evening bell. Eat whatever stew had been prepared. Always the same base of potatoes and onions with occasional gristle that might have once been meat. Return to dormitory. Sleep. Repeat. But there were the dreams, always the dreams, that made her wake gasping with a longing so profound it felt like grief. Dreams of forests silver in moonlight, of running on 4 legs with power coiled in muscle she did not possess, of voices calling a name that was hers but also was not, of a presence so vast and warm it felt like coming home to a place she had never been. She would wake from these dreams with tears on her face and a word on her lips that dissolved the moment consciousness returned, leaving only an ache in her chest and the certain knowledge that she had lost something irreplaceable, though she could not remember what it was or how it had been taken. Winter had not cried, not truly cried, in 6 years. Tears required hope, required the belief that suffering was temporary and relief possible, and she had traded those beliefs for the much more useful skill of numbness, of existing somewhere deep inside herself where Margot's punishments could not reach, where the endless gray days could not touch whatever small thing remained that was purely hers. But beneath the numbness lived something else, something she did not examine too closely, because it felt dangerous, felt wild, felt like the snarling thing that lived behind her ribs and demanded freedom she did not know how to find. It was rage, cold and patient. Rage that had been building for 8 years in the space where her memories should have been. Rage that waited for an opportunity she could not imagine and did not dare hope for. On the day everything changed, Winter was assigned a task she had not performed in months. Margot appeared beside her loom 2 hours after the morning bell, her severe face arranged in an expression of calculated displeasure, and informed Winter that she was to deliver fabric samples to the merchant district, to a shop whose name Margot wrote on a slip of paper with unnecessary force, as if the act of writing caused her physical pain. Winter took the paper, took the carefully wrapped samples, and walked out of the factory into afternoon sunlight that hurt her eyes with its brightness, into air that did not taste of cotton dust, into a world that seemed impossibly large after the confines of the factory floor. She had not eaten in 2 days, one of Margot's periodic punishments for perceived infractions Winter could no longer remember committing, and by the time she reached the merchant district, her vision had started to narrow at the edges, her legs trembling with an exhaustion that went deeper than muscle and bone. The samples felt impossibly heavy in her arms. The cobblestone street seemed to tilt beneath her feet. And then there was nothing but darkness and the sensation of falling, and somewhere very far away, the sound of carriage wheels stopping, and a voice, deep and layered with something that was not quite human, saying words she could not understand but that her body recognized with a violence that felt like waking after years of sleep. When the king came to Southport, Winter woke to the sensation of heat, real heat, not the stifling, oppressive warmth of the factory floor, but something that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, wrapping around her like a blanket she had not known she needed. Her eyes opened slowly, vision swimming into focus to reveal the interior of a carriage far more luxurious than anything she had seen in her remembered life, all dark wood paneling and velvet cushions in deep burgundy, and there, sitting across from her with an intensity that made her breath catch, was a man who could not possibly be real. He was impossibly tall, even seated, with shoulders broad enough to fill the space in a way that should have felt threatening, but instead felt oddly protective, as if his body had positioned itself between her and every danger the world
contained. His hair was black and long,
pulled back from a face all sharp angles and hard lines, a face that would have been beautiful if not for its severity, if not for the scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, like someone had tried to split his face open and failed. But it was his eyes that held her frozen, eyes that were not quite human, golden amber that seemed to glow with their own light, eyes that looked at her with a recognition so absolute it felt like being seen for the first time in her entire existence. The moment his gaze locked with hers, something happened inside Winter's chest, something that felt like a door being torn open, like chains snapping, like every cell in her body suddenly remembering a purpose it had forgotten. The iron cuff around her wrist flared hot, actually hot for the first time in 8 years, burning against her skin with an intensity that made her gasp, and the man across from her went completely still, the kind of stillness that belonged to predators before they struck, his eyes blazing brighter, his hands gripping the edge of the seat with enough force that she heard the wood crack. The air pressure in the carriage changed, became thick and electric, became charged with something Winter had no name for, but that her body recognized with a terror and longing so intertwined she could not separate them. She tried to speak, to ask where she was, who he was, what was happening, but no sound emerged. Her throat closed around words that felt inadequate for the magnitude of whatever was occurring. And then he moved, leaning forward slowly, deliberately, his nostrils flaring as if he were scenting her. And when he spoke, his voice was deeper than any voice she had heard, layered with something that resonated in her bones, and made the thing inside her chest snarl in response. "Who put that on you?" he said. And it was not a question but a demand, his gaze fixed on the iron cuff with an expression that transformed his face from severe to absolutely murderous. And Winter found herself pressing back against the velvet prisons, her pulse hammering in her throat, every instinct she possessed screaming at her to run, while simultaneously demanding she move closer, demanding she touch him, demanding she do something she had no framework to understand. The carriage door opened and another man appeared, younger, with sandy brown hair and green eyes that widened the moment they landed on Winter, then shifted to the man across from her with an expression of shock so profound it bordered on alarm. "My king," the newcomer said, and Winter's mind stuttered over the word king. Because it made no sense. Nothing made sense. Is she... And he did not finish the question, but the king, if that was what he was, answered anyway. "Mine," he said, and the word came out layered with that inhuman resonance, came out like a growl and a prayer and an absolute statement of fact. "She's mine." Winter tried to stand, tried to leave, tried to do anything that would put distance between herself and whatever was happening, but her legs would not support her, still weak from hunger and the collapse and something else, something to do with the way the king was looking at her, like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life. "I need to go back," she managed to say, her voice emerging thin and reedy. "The factory, Overseer Sable will..." And she stopped because the king's expression had shifted into something so feral she forgot how to finish sentences. "You are not going back there," he said, and it was not a suggestion or an offer, but a statement of reality he was personally ensuring. "You are never going back there." And then, as if summoned by the mention of her name, Overseer Margot Sable appeared at the carriage door, her severe face arranged in an expression of false courtesy that did not reach her eyes that flickered between Winter and the king with barely concealed calculation. "Your Majesty," Margot said, and the title confirmed what Winter's mind was still struggling to accept. "I apologize for any inconvenience, but this girl is factory property, under legal contract of indenture. She must return to fulfill her obligations, and I must insist..." And whatever else she intended to say dissolved into silence, because the king had turned his attention to her fully. The sound that emerged from him was not human, was not anything that should have come from a human throat, was a growl so deep and resonant that Winter felt it in her chest, felt the windows of nearby buildings rattle, felt the very air vibrate with a warning that transcended language. Margot went absolutely white, stepping back from the carriage as if she had been struck, her professional facade cracking to reveal genuine fear underneath, and Winter watched with a confusion so complete she felt dizzy as this woman who had controlled every aspect of her existence for 8 years retreated from a single sound like it carried the promise of death. "Fletcher, the king said, without looking away from Margot, his voice still carrying that layered quality that Winter's skin prickle. Take her name, take the factory name, take everything. And then he leaned forward slightly, and Winter saw Margot actually flinch. If you attempt
to approach her again, if you send anyone to approach her, if you so much as think her name with intent to reclaim her, I will personally ensure you understand exactly what it means to displease me. Do you comprehend? It was not a question. Margot nodded once, jerkily, her composure completely shattered, and then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd that had gathered at a careful distance, and Winter was left staring at this king who had just unmade her entire world with a handful of words and a sound that should not have been possible. The man named Fletcher had produced a notebook and was writing rapidly, glancing between his notes and Margot's retreating figure with an efficiency that suggested he had performed similar tasks before. The king turned back to Winter, and his expression softened fractionally, though softened was perhaps too gentle a word for the intensity that remained in those impossible golden eyes. "You're safe now," he said, and Winter wanted to laugh because she had not felt safe in 8 years, and she certainly did not feel safe now, trapped in a carriage with a man who made sounds that shattered windows and looked at her like she belonged to him in ways she could not begin to understand. But she also felt something else, something that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the way her body was responding to his proximity, the way the thing inside her chest was straining toward him, the way the iron cuff on her wrist continued to burn hot as if trying to fight against something it could not contain. "Where are you taking me?" Winter asked, and her voice came out stronger than she expected, came out with an edge of demand that surprised her. "Home," the king said simply. "I'm taking you home." What the cuff conceals. Winter woke in a room that belonged in dreams, all soaring ceilings and tall windows that let in morning light the color of honey, light that fell across furniture carved from dock wood and polished until it gleamed, across carpets thick enough that her feet disappeared into them, across a bed so large and soft she had initially refused to believe it was meant for sleeping. The Graymark estate, Fletcher had called it when they arrived the previous evening, his tone suggesting the name should mean something to her, though like everything else in her fractured existence, it rang hollow, familiar and foreign at once. She had barely slept, her body unable to reconcile the softness of the mattress with 8 years of a thin pallet in a dormitory that smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the king's gaze on her, felt that
an impossible pull in her chest that had not diminished with distance, felt the iron cuff burning against her wrist as if it were alive and aware and fighting against something it desperately wanted to prevent. Now, in the gray light of early morning, she examined the cuff more closely than she had in years, tracing the runes that seemed to writhe under her fingertips, and for the first time she allowed herself to wonder not just who had put it on her, but what it was meant to do. A knock at the door preceded the king's entrance by barely a second, as if he had knocked purely as formality rather than actual request for permission, and Winter found herself standing without conscious decision, her body responding to his presence in ways her mind had not authorized. He looked different in daylight, no less imposing but somehow more real, more human, though his eyes still carried that golden luminescence that marked him as something other. He had changed from the severe black of yesterday into clothing only marginally less formal, still dark, still expensive, still fitted to his considerable frame in a way that suggested violence barely contained beneath civilization. "We need to talk," he said, and gestured to the chairs arranged near the windows, waiting until she sat before taking the seat across from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, that same impossible warmth that had filled the carriage. "What do you know about what you are?" It was not the question Winter had expected, and she found herself answering honestly before she could consider the wisdom of truth. "I don't know what I am," she said. "I don't know anything except the factory and the 8 years I've lived there. Everything before that is—" she paused, searching for words adequate to describe the blankness. "Gone, like it never existed at all." Something passed across the king's face, an expression too complex to name, part rage and part grief, and part something that looked almost like recognition. "The cuff," he said, his gaze dropping to her wrist with an intensity that made her want to hide it behind her back. "That's why. It's suppressing more than you realize, more than should be possible." Before Winter could ask what he meant, Fletcher entered, followed by an elderly woman Winter recognized from the factory, a worker who had always watched her with eyes too knowing, too sad, too aware. Old Meredith, the others had called her, a woman who kept to herself and spoke rarely, and seemed to exist on the periphery of notice. But here, in this room, she moved with a purpose that belied her apparent frailty, her gaze sharp as He approached Winter and held out a weathered hand. "May I?" Meredith asked, and when Winter nodded, uncertain what she was consenting to, the old woman's fingers closed around the iron cuff with a grip stronger than should be possible. The moment she made contact, the air in the room changed, became charged with something that made Winter's hair stand on end, and Meredith's eyes, which Winter had always assumed were brown, flashed silver bright. "Memory-binding magic," Meredith said, her voice losing its quaver and emerging clear and firm. "Identity suppression, consciousness alteration, illegal magic, the kind that hasn't been practiced openly in 50 years because it destroys what makes a person themselves." Winter felt her lungs constrict, felt her vision narrow, felt 8 years of careful numbness crack open to reveal terror underneath. "What does that mean?" she managed to ask. "It means someone wanted you forgotten," the king said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together in a way that suggested he was restraining himself from reaching for her. "It means someone took your memories, your identity, everything you were, and locked it away so completely you couldn't access it, couldn't even know it was missing." Meredith released Winter's wrist and stepped back, her expression heavy with something that looked like old guilt. "The question is why," she said. "Why go to this much trouble? Why use this much power? Why keep her alive but imprisoned in such specific ways?" The king's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the scar that marked his face. "Because she's the last of the Ashcroft bloodline," he said, and Winter felt the words land like physical blows, even though they meant nothing to her, meant less than nothing, were just sounds without context. "Your family controlled the Eastern Territories, the silver mines that produced the only metal capable of containing certain types of magic. They were one of the oldest royal lines, allied with mine through bonds that went back generations." He stood then, moved to the windows and stared out at grounds Winter had not yet seen in full daylight, his shoulders rigid with tension. "3 years ago I became Alpha King, after my entire family was assassinated," he continued, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested the control cost him. "Before he died, your father made me swear an oath, made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find you, would protect you, would ensure the Ashcroft line survived." Winter tried to process what he was saying, tried to fit these impossible claims into the framework of her understanding, and found them simply would not go. "I'm not," she started to say. "I'm just a factory worker. I'm nobody. I'm nothing." And the king turned back to her with such sudden intensity she stopped breathing. "You are Winter Ashcroft," he said, crossing back to her in 3 long strides, dropping into a crouch before her chair so their eyes were level, so she could see the gold flecks in his irises that seemed to swirl like liquid metal. "You are the heir to one of the most powerful bloodlines in our world. You are—" He paused, something shifting in his expression, something vulnerable breaking through the severity. "You are mine, destined, bound, mine in ways that transcend politics or promises, mine in ways I have been searching for without knowing what I was searching for until the moment I saw you." "The bond," Fletcher said quietly from where he stood near the door. Winter had almost forgotten he was there. "What you felt yesterday in the carriage, what you're feeling now, that's the mate bond. It's rare, it's powerful, and it's absolute. There's no mistaking it when it happens." Winter looked down at the cuff, at the runes that suddenly seemed less like decoration and more like chains, like prison bars made of metal and magic. "Someone did this to me," she said slowly. "Someone killed my family, someone took my memories, someone locked me away and watched me for 8 years. "Lord Chancellor Percival Whitlock," the king said, and the name emerged coated in venom. "He's been consolidating power for years, eliminating royal bloodlines through assassination and legal manipulation. He controls most of the Alpha Council now through favors and blackmail and carefully orchestrated debts. Your family stood in his way, controlled resources he wanted, represented power he couldn't possess." 7 days of truth. Over the 7 days that followed, Winter's existence transformed in ways she could not process, in ways that felt like being unmade and remade simultaneously, each piece of her former understanding stripped away to reveal something underneath that felt both familiar and terrifyingly foreign. Evander, she had learned his name on the 2nd day when Fletcher had used it in casual conversation, and the king had not corrected him, had installed her in rooms adjacent to his own chambers, a suite of spaces so vast she could have fit the entire factory dormitory inside them with room to spare,
and he had issued instructions to his household staff with the kind of authority that suggested he expected instant obedience and had never been disappointed. "She eats with me," he had said that first evening, standing in the doorway of her rooms.
While she examined the contents of the wardrobe someone had filled with clothing in her approximate size, all of it finer than anything she remembered touching. "Every meal in my private dining room, until she's strong enough that I can trust she won't collapse again." On the first night, Winter had attempted to serve him, had stood when the food arrived and reached for the platters, with movements ingrained by 8 years of understanding her place in the hierarchy of things, and Evander had caught her wrist, not the one bearing the cuff, but the other one, his grip gentle but absolutely immovable. "You sit," he had said, his voice quiet but carrying that layered quality that made her bones vibrate. "You eat, you rest, you recover. You are not a servant here. You are not a worker. You are." And he had stopped, something complicated passing across his face. "You are what you are always meant to be." The food had been more than Winter could comprehend. Roasted meat and fresh bread, and vegetables prepared in ways that made them taste like entirely different substances than the boiled, flavorless versions she remembered. And she had eaten slowly, carefully, aware of Evander's gaze on her throughout, aware of the way he seemed to relax fractionally each time she took a bite, as if her nourishment was somehow his responsibility and her hunger his personal failure. By the third day, Fletcher had begun teaching her to read the pack histories, massive leather-bound volumes kept in Greymark's library, a room that smelled of old paper and wood smoke, and contained more books than Winter had known existed. She discovered she could read, that literacy had not been taken from her even if everything else had, and the histories revealed a world far more complex than she had imagined. Hierarchies of alphas and betas and omegas, territorial divisions that had existed for centuries, and references, repeated references, to the Ashcroft line and their silver wolves, rare and powerful and marked by abilities other bloodlines did not possess. "What abilities?" Winter had asked, tracing her finger over a passage that described an Ashcroft ancestor who had ended a war through force of will alone. Fletcher had exchanged a glance with Evander, who had been sitting near the fireplace, ostensibly reading reports, but who Winter suspected had been listening to every word. "We don't know exactly," Fletcher had said carefully. "The records are incomplete, deliberately destroyed in many cases, but silver wolves were said to be faster, stronger, their senses more acute, and they had some capacity for what the old texts call presence, the ability to influence others through sheer force of dominance, like what Evander did to Overseer Sable," Winter had said, and both men had gone still in a way that suggested she had said something significant. "Evander is an alpha king," Fletcher had explained. "Royal bloodlines carry power beyond normal alphas. It's genetic, measurable, absolute. An alpha king can command any wolf of lower rank, can break through magical barriers that are destroying if it still showed beneath the frame despite the late hour." She had raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, uncertain what she would say, why she had come, what she wanted. But the door had opened anyway, and Evander stood there looking unsurprised to see her. "Can't sleep?" he had said, statement not question, and when she shook her head he had stepped aside to let her enter, gesturing to the chair near his desk while he returned to his own seat, to the papers spread before him that she now recognized as reports from his network of spies and informants. They had sat in silence for a time, Winter watching him work, watching the way his brow furrowed when he read something troubling, the way his hand would occasionally rise to touch the scar on his face as if it pained him, and finally she had asked the question that had been building since that first day. "Why do you care? About me, about the oath, about any of this? You are the king, you could have ignored it." Evander had looked up from his papers, his golden eyes catching the lamplight, and for a long moment he had simply studied her as if trying to decide how much truth to offer. "My family was murdered 10 years ago," he had said finally. "My parents, my 2 younger sisters, my uncle who served as beta, all of them killed in a single night by assassins we never identified, but who I know were sent by Whitlock, because who else had the resources and the motivation and the absolute lack of conscience required?" He had leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "I became Alpha King at 21, younger than any king in 5 generations, and I was alone in ways I cannot adequately describe, surrounded by wolves who,
looked to me for leadership while I was barely holding myself together. And the only thing that kept me functional was rage and the promise I made to your father 3 months before he died. The promise that I would protect you if anything happened. because our families had been allied for 200 years, and that meant something. It had to mean something. Winter had felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she had been maintaining without realizing it. "And then you found me," she had said softly. "And then I found you," Evander had agreed. "And the bond," he had paused, his hands flattening on the desk as if bracing himself. "The bond means you're not just an oath to fulfill. You're mine in ways that go beyond duty, beyond politics, beyond anything rational. And I know you don't feel it fully yet, because the cuff is suppressing that too, suppressing your wolf, and with it your ability to sense what we are to each other. But I feel it. And it's," he had stopped, seeming to struggle for words, "it's everything. The Whitlock Protocol." Fletcher burst into the breakfast room on the morning of the 8th day with an urgency that shattered the careful peace Winter had been constructing over her toast and tea, his face pale in a way that made Evander rise from his chair with the kind of fluid speed that reminded Winter he was predator first and man second. "We intercepted a telegram," Fletcher said without preamble, pulling a slip of paper from his coat and laying it on the table between them. "Whitlock to Margot Sable, encoded, but our cryptographer broke it in an hour. He's ordered Winter's assassin to clinic with the sudden crystalline understanding that someone hated her enough to orchestrate 8 years of imprisonment, followed by murder." Evander's hand slammed down on the table, hard enough to crack the wood, his eyes blazing gold, so bright she had to look away, and the growl that emerged from him made the windows rattle in their frames. Fletcher continued with the kind of calm that suggested he was accustomed to delivering terrible news. "I pulled everything we have on Whitlock, went back 10 years, cross-referenced with the Ashcroft massacre. And Winter," he turned to look at her directly, his green eyes heavy with sympathy. "It was him. We have testimony from 3 different
Documents that place Whitlock's personal guards at your family estate the night of the fire. We have financial records showing payment to known assassins. We have correspondence that," he paused, "that details exactly how he planned to consolidate control of the eastern silver mines by eliminating your bloodline." The room seemed to tilt sideways, reality bending in ways Winter's mind could not accommodate. "My family," she heard herself say from very far away. "He killed my family. He killed them and then he, what, kept me alive? Why would he keep me alive if he wanted us dead?" Evander had moved to stand behind her chair, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders with a weight that somehow anchored her to the present. "Legal complications," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "If you had died with your family, the Ashcroft territories would have reverted to crown control, to me as Alpha King, and I would have maintained your family's alliances and trade agreements. But if you disappeared, if there was no body, no confirmed death, then the territories fell into legal limbo, and Whitlock positioned himself as interim administrator through the council. He's been mining your lands for 8 years and funneling the profits into his own network." "So he needed me gone but not dead," Winter said slowly, understanding crystallizing into something sharp and painful. "He needed me, what, lost, forgotten, unable to claim my own inheritance?" Fletcher nodded grimly. "The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Keep you alive and suppressed until enough time passed that he could legally declare the Ashcroft line extinct, petition the council to grant him permanent control of the territories. By our calculations, he was 2 years away from being able to do exactly that when Evander found you." "Which is why he wants me dead now," Winter finished, the logic clicking into place with horrible clarity. "Because Evander identified me publicly, because I'm no longer lost, because if the cuff comes off and my memories return fully, I can testify to what was done and reclaim everything he's stolen." Meredith had been standing in the doorway throughout this exchange, silent and watchful, and now she stepped forward with the air of someone preparing to deliver additional bad news. "The cuff must come off today," she said flatly. "I've spent the week preparing the ritual, gathering the components, weaving the counterspells necessary to prevent your mind from shattering when 8 years of suppressed memory returns all at once. But if Whitlock has ordered your death, then waiting is no longer an option. You need your wolf. You need your full strength. And you need your memories if you're going to survive what's coming." Winter looked up at Evander, at the king who had found her and claimed her, and was now looking at her with an expression that managed to contain fury and fear and determination in equal measure. "Will it hurt?" she asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. "Yes," Meredith said before Evander could offer comforting lies. "It will hurt worse than anything you've experienced. Memory restoration always does. But suppression this deep, this long, it's going to feel like dying. But you'll survive it.
because Ashcroft wolves don't break easily, and because you have an alpha king who will hold you through every second of it. The ritual took 3 hours in a room Meredith had prepared, all the furniture removed and replaced with a circle of salt and silver dust, candles burning at cardinal points, with flames that flickered blue and green instead of orange, and Winter kneeling in the center, while Meredith chanted in a language that predated written history, and Evander knelt behind her with his arms wrapped around her waist, his chest against her back, his voice in her ear promising over and over that she was safe, that he had her, that she would not face this alone. When Meredith's hands closed over the iron cuff and began to pull, Winter understood what dying felt like. The cuff resisted, the magic woven into it fighting against removal with a violence that made her scream, made her thrash against Evander's hold, made her vision white out with pain that started at her wrist and spread through her entire body like fire in her veins. And then it released, all at once, the cuff falling away in pieces that dissolved into ash before hitting the ground, and the memories came flooding back with a force that drove her to her hands and knees, while Evander's arms remained locked around her, his voice layered with wolf as he commanded her to breathe, to stay with him, to come back. She remembered her mother's face clearly now, remembered her laugh and her strength, and the way she had ruled the Eastern Territories with fairness and absolute authority. Remembered her father teaching her to shift for the first time, the agony and ecstasy of bones reforming and fur sprouting, and her wolf emerging silver bright and faster than anything else in the pack. Remembered her younger brother, who had been 6 years old with their father's eyes and their mother's smile. Remembered the night of fire and screaming. Remembered Whitlock's face as he stood in the doorway of her room and watched his guards drag her from her bed. Remembered fighting. Remembered failing. Remembered
The moment they forced the cuff onto her wrist and everything she was began to dissolve into nothing. Winter emerged from the memories, broken and remade, her face wet with tears she did not remember crying, her throat raw from screaming. And Evander was there, solid and real, his own face wet, as if her pain had been his pain, his hands gentle as they cupped her face and forced her to look at him. "You survived," he said fiercely. "You survived everything they did to you, and you're still here, and I swear by everything I am that Whitlock will answer for what he's taken from you." The council's judgment. The journey to North Haven took 2 days by steam train, 2 days during which Winter existed in a state of hyper-awareness that bordered on unbearable. Her newly freed wolf prowling just beneath her skin, demanding release she did not yet know how to give safely, demanding violence against those who had caged her, demanding blood and justice and retribution that felt righteous in its intensity. Evander had secured an entire private car for their party, Fletcher and Bridget Keller flanking them at all times with the kind of vigilance that suggested they expected attack at any moment. And perhaps they did. Perhaps Whitlock's reach extended even here, to the rails and stations between Greymark territory and the capital. Evander barely left her side, positioning himself between her and the door, between her and the windows, between her and every potential threat with a protectiveness that would have felt suffocating, if not for the bond that now sang between them fully realized, now that her wolf could sense his wolf, now that she could feel his emotions bleeding through the connection like a second heartbeat layered over her own. He was terrified, she realized on the second morning, watching him pretend to read reports while his jaw remained locked with tension. Terrified in ways he would never admit aloud. Terrified not of the council or Whitlock or political machinations, but of losing her, of having found his mate only to watch her be torn away by systems designed to protect wolves like Whitlock, who wore authority like a mask over corruption. The council hall in North Haven was older than the city surrounding it, a massive stone structure that predated modern architecture by centuries, all Gothic arches and stained glass windows depicting the first alphas who had established the territorial accords. And Winter felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders as they entered through doors 20 feet tall, guarded by wolves whose eyes tracked their movement with professional assessment. Inside, the circular chamber held tiered seating for 50 alphas, each representing their territorial pack, each wielding vote and voice in matters of law and succession and justice. And at the center, presiding from a raised platform, sat Lord Chancellor Percival Whitlock. He looked exactly as Winter's restored memories painted him, thin and silver-haired and perfectly composed, his gray eyes cold as they landed on her with an expression that managed to convey surprise and calculation and dismissal in the span of a heartbeat. "Your Majesty," Whitlock said with a courtesy so false it bordered on mockery,
What an unexpected pleasure, and with such an interesting companion. Surely you don't mean to present this, he paused delicately, this woman as the lost Ashcroft heir. Surely you have evidence beyond your own desires to support such an extraordinary claim. The trial began with a formality that felt like slow suffocation, each side presenting opening statements. Evander's voice carrying through the chamber with the kind of absolute authority that came from being Alpha King, but that clearly grated against the council members who had grown accustomed to Whitlock's subtler manipulation. Winter testified for an hour, describing her captivity in clinical detail, describing the cuff and its effects, describing the memories that had returned in vivid horror when the suppression finally broke. And she watched several alphas shift uncomfortably in their seats, watched others lean forward with interest, watched Whitlock's expression remain perfectly neutral, even as she detailed his presence the night her family died. Fletcher presented Meredith's magical analysis of the cuff fragments, presented the intercepted telegrams between Whitlock and Margot Sable, presented financial records that showed systematic looting of Ashcroft resources over 8 years. And for a moment, for one crystalline moment, Winter thought they might actually prevail through truth alone. And then Whitlock began his counter-presentation, and Winter understood exactly how he had maintained power for so long, how he had eliminated rivals and consolidated authority while maintaining the appearance of lawful procedure. The witnesses Whitlock called painted Winter as willing factory worker, as opportunistic woman who had seduced the Alpha King with false claims of noble blood, as disturbed individual whose memories were not restoration but invention, planted by Evander's own desires to claim Ashcroft territories through a convenient mate bond. They presented documents, official-looking papers with stamps and signatures, that showed a different Winter Ashcroft had died 8 years ago, buried in the ruins of her family estate, her death confirmed by 3 separate investigators. They suggested, with careful legal language, that Evander had been manipulated by a cunning servant girl who bore passing resemblance to the lost heir and who had fabricated an entire identity to escape her lawful indenture. Winter watched the council's opinion shift with each new testimony, watched doubt creep across faces that had seemed sympathetic moments before, watched Whitlock's subtle smile as he orchestrated her destruction through 1,000 careful lies stacked upon each other until they resembled truth. The vote began to swing against them, against her, council members murmuring among themselves with the kind of concerned gravity that preceded condemnation, and Whitlock called for a formal ruling, called for Winter to be arrested for fraud and identity theft, called for Evander to be censured for conspiracy to manipulate territorial succession. Evander moved before the words had finished leaving Whitlock's mouth, rising from his seat with violence barely leashed, his eyes blazing gold so bright they cast shadows, and Winter felt his wolf surge forward with an intensity that made the air pressure in the chamber drop, made several nearby alphas stumble back in instinctive retreat. "You dare," Evander said, his voice layered with command that resonated in Winter's bones, in every bone in the chamber. "You dare to threaten her, to threaten me, to stand there wearing authority while your hands are soaked in the blood of families you've destroyed." Winter grabbed his arm, feeling the muscles locked rigid beneath her fingers, feeling his wolf raging for release that would doom them both if given. "If you attack him here, we've lost," she said urgently, pulling his attention to her face, to her eyes that she knew were reflecting silver now that her wolf lived so close to the surface. "This is what he wants. This is the trap. You losing control in front of the council, so they have justification to remove you." Whitlock's smile widened fractionally, triumph glinting in those cold gray eyes. "Arrest them both," he commanded, gesturing to the council guards, who moved forward with spelled restraints designed to suppress shifting. And chaos erupted, as Evander's wolves, Fletcher and Bridget and 6 others who had accompanied them, moved to intercept. The chamber descended into violence, guards and Greymark wolves clashing, while council members shouted over each other, while Whitlock remained perfectly still on his platform, watching his plan unfold. And Winter felt hands close on her arms, felt herself dragged
backward, away from Evander, who roared with a sound that cracked stone. They separated them, Evander thrown into the council dungeons beneath the hall, where spelled cells had contained dangerous wolves for 3 centuries, cells designed specifically to prevent shifting through magical suppression woven into the very stones. Winter they took elsewhere, to Whitlock's private estate on the edge of the capital, to a tower room that might have been beautiful if it were not obviously a prison, all stone walls and a single window too high to reach, and a door that locked from outside, with mechanisms she could hear sliding into place with terminal finality. Whitlock came to her an hour later, entering without knocking, his composure absolute as he regarded her with the kind of detached interest a collector might show a particularly troublesome acquisition. "You were supposed to remain forgotten," he said conversationally, crossing to stand near the window, where afternoon light painted him in shades of gold that felt obscene on someone so fundamentally rotten. The cuff was expensive. The magic required was nearly impossible to source, but it was worth it to ensure you stayed exactly where I placed you, docile and useful and utterly erased. Winter felt her wolf snarl inside her chest, felt silver fur ripple beneath her skin, and forced herself to remain still, to listen, to learn. "Why?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "Why keep me alive at all? Why not just kill me with my family?" Whitlock smiled, a terrible expression that held no warmth. "Legal complications, my dear. The territories needed time to fully transition into my control. A missing heir created ambiguity I could exploit, but a living heir who might someday resurface was a risk I managed through careful surveillance. I had 8 years planned, 8 years of you existing in productive obscurity before I could finalize the legal extinction of your bloodline and claim everything your family built. And now," Winter said quietly, "now you'll have a tragic accident," Whitlock said with the same conversational tone. "You'll be found dead, a suicide perhaps, driven to madness by false memories and delusions of grandeur. And your mate," he paused over the word with distaste, "your mate will be convicted of your murder, since you were last seen in his custody. I'll have him executed publicly for the crime, and install a council-approved regent to manage Greymark territories, and the eastern mines will be legally mine within the month." When the king's wolf broke free, Evander broke through the spelled chains at 3 in the morning, a feat no alpha had accomplished in the 200-year history of the council dungeons, broke through them with sheer force of will and rage, and the absolute certainty that Winter was in danger, that she needed him, that every second he remained caged was a second she faced Whitlock alone. The magic woven into the restraints was ancient and powerful, designed to suppress shifting through constant low-level pain that increased exponentially with resistance. But what the original architects had not accounted for was an alpha king driven by mate bond stretched beyond endurance, by 3 centuries of royal bloodline breeding for power, by fury so absolute it transcended flesh and became something closer to natural disaster. The guards found him standing in a cell that looked like something had exploded from the inside, the spelled chains in pieces around his feet, his hands bleeding from where the magic had burned him during the breaking, his eyes blazing gold so bright they illuminated the dark corridor. And when he spoke, his voice carried the layered resonance of wolf and man so perfectly merged that both guards dropped to their knees in instinctive submission before conscious thought could intervene. "Where is she?" Evander said, and it was not a question but a command that rewrote reality around it, that made telling him anything but truth physically impossible. "Whitlock Estate," the first guard gasped, his wolf howling inside him to obey this superior predator. "The tower on the eastern side. My king, please, we were following orders." And Evander was already moving, already gone, leaving them trembling in the corridor while he ascended stairs 3 at a time, emerging into the main level of the council hall, where Fletcher and Bridget were already moving, already gathering the Greymark wolves with efficiency that suggested they had been planning this exact extraction since the moment of his capture. "How?" Fletcher started to ask, staring at Evander's bleeding hands, at the impossible fact of his freedom, but Evander cut him off with a gesture. "Later," he said flatly. "Whitlock has Winter. We go now, full pack. And if anyone tries to stop us, you have my permission to remove them permanently." They moved through North Haven's streets like a storm, 60 wolves in human form flowing through the pre-dawn darkness with purpose that made early risers scramble out of their path. And by the time they reached Whitlock's estate, the sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that felt obscene against what Evander intended to do. The estate was walled and guarded, a fortress designed to keep out everything except an alpha king who
had lost the careful control he maintained for public consumption, who had let his wolf rise so close to the surface that his bones ached with the proximity of shifting, who howled with his human throat in a way that made windows shatter 3 blocks away, and guards stumble back from their posts with hands clasped over their ears. Parallel to this approach, Winter stood in Whitlock's private study, having escaped the tower through methods Bridget Keller had taught her during their training sessions, methods involving lockpicks fashioned from hairpins, and patience learned through years of factory work that required precision under pressure. The study was everything she had hoped to find. Decades of correspondence meticulously filed, ledgers showing payments to assassins and bribes to council members, and there, in a locked drawer she broke open with a heavy bookend, documents bearing Whitlock's personal seal that detailed exactly how he had orchestrated the Ashcroft massacre. Names and dates and methods described with the clinical detachment of a man who viewed murder as administrative necessity. Winter was gathering these papers, evidence that would be undeniable even to the most corrupt council member, when Margot Sable entered through a side door with a knife in her hand, and an expression that suggested 8 years of playing prison warden had given her ideas about her own importance. "You should have stayed where I put you," Margot said, advancing with the knife held low and professional. "Should have stayed docile and useful and forgotten. But you had to fight, had to survive, had to make everything complicated." The fight was brief and brutal, Winter's newly awakened wolf giving her speed Margot could not match, giving her strength that went beyond her slight frame. And when Margot lunged, Winter moved on pure instinct, felt her body begin to shift in ways she had not consciously intended, felt silver fur ripple across her arms, felt her bones start to reform, and the sensation was agony and ecstasy, was 8 years of suppression releasing in a single violent moment. She caught Margot's wrist, felt bones snap beneath her grip that was no longer entirely human, and Margot screamed, dropping the knife, stumbling backward into a bookshelf with eyes wide with the kind of terror that came from recognizing predator where she had expected prey. Winter let her go, let her collapse to the floor clutching her broken wrist, and gathered the documents with hands that trembled as her body fought to complete the shift she had interrupted, fought to become the wolf that had been caged too long. She ran, documents
Immense clutched to her chest, through corridors that were starting to fill with guards responding to Margot's screams, and emerged into the main entrance hall just as Evander broke through the front doors with violence that sent wood and metal flying inward like shrapnel. The moment their eyes met across the chaos, Winter felt the bond flare so bright it nearly drove her to her knees, felt Evander's relief and rage and love cascade through the connection in a wave that made her gasp, and she threw the documents toward Fletcher, who caught them with practiced ease, while Evander crossed the distance between them in 3 ground-eating strides. "You're safe," he said, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the destruction he had just caused, his eyes searching hers for injury, for trauma, for anything that would require him to kill someone. "You're safe now." They fought together as Whitlock's guards attempted to contain them, fought with a synchronization that came from the bond rather than training. Evander's brutal efficiency paired with Winter's savage instinct, her wolf so close to the surface now that her eyes blazed silver and her movements carried predatory grace she had not possessed a week ago. Guards fell back, overwhelmed by an alpha king who had stopped restraining his power, and a silver wolf who fought like something with nothing left to lose. And then they were moving deeper into the estate, following Whitlock's scent, following the trail of a man who had finally realized his careful plans were unraveling. They found him in a study identical to the one Winter had broken into, attempting to escape through a hidden passage that Winter's newly sharp senses detected before he could activate it. She moved to block his path with speed that startled them both, and Whitlock froze, trapped between a furious alpha king and the air he had tried to erase, his composure finally cracking to reveal genuine fear underneath. "You don't get to run," Winter said quietly. Her voice emerged layered with wolf in a way she had not intended, but that felt right, felt powerful, felt like reclaiming everything he had taken. Evander's hand on her shoulder was gentle restraint, grounding rather than controlling. "He faces justice publicly," Evander said, though his voice suggested he wanted violence as much as Winter did. "The council sees what he is, sees the evidence, sees him broken before wolves he thought he controlled." Fletcher appeared, eared in the doorway with a contingent of council members, alphas Winter recognized from the trial, their faces shocked as they took in the scene, as they accepted the documents Fletcher offered, as they read Whitlock's own words condemning him. The tide turned in that moment, turned as completely as it had turned against Winter the day before, and she watched Whitlock's face cycle through denial and rage and finally despair, as he understood that his decades of careful manipulation had been destroyed in a single night by an alpha king and a silver wolf he had underestimated catastrophically. The silver wolf's crown.
The formal council assembly 1 week later bore no resemblance to the trial that had preceded it. The chamber filled not with Whitlock's carefully positioned allies, but ways of manipulation unraveled under scrutiny that Whitlock had prevented through fear and blackmail, and the careful cultivation of a reputation for untouchable authority. Winter watched from her seat beside Evander as Whitlock was brought before the council in spelled restraints, his silver hair no longer perfectly groomed, his cold gray eyes no longer quite so confident, and she felt not triumph exactly, but something closer to exhausted relief, the kind that came after surviving something that should have destroyed her. The sentence was life imprisonment in a spelled cell deep beneath the council hall, the same dungeons Evander had broken free from, but reinforced with additional magic, additional restraints, additional assurances that Whitlock would spend his remaining years experiencing the kind of captivity he had inflicted on others. Winter testified again, but this time to a council that listened with genuine attention, that asked questions with concern rather than skepticism, that formally recognized her as the last surviving Ashcroft heir with all rights and territories restored. The apologies came after, inadequate words from alphas who had voted against her, who had believed Whitlock's lies, who now sought to distance themselves from complicity in his crimes. And Winter accepted them with a grace she had learned from watching her mother in recovered memories, with the understanding that rebuilding requires forgiveness even when it tasted bitter. Evander pushed through reforms with the kind of relentless determination that characterized everything he did, making memory magic illegal under penalty of permanent banishment, establishing independent oversight for
Council proceedings requiring public disclosure of territorial resource management, systematically dismantling the power structures Whitlock had built over decades. Winter watched him work with admiration that deepened daily, watched him balance authority with fairness, watched him listen to advisors while maintaining ultimate decision-making power, watched him transform from the severe, isolated king she had first met into someone who wielded power with wisdom rather than just force. On the 5th day after Whitlock's sentencing, Winter stood in the council chamber while Evander formally proposed the merger of Ashcroft and Greymark territories, the unification of eastern and northern lands under joint rule, and she felt every eye in the room turn to her, waiting for her response. "I don't want to rule alone," Winter said clearly, her voice carrying through the chamber without effort now that her wolf lived so close to the surface, without needing amplification or repetition. "I've been alone enough, isolated enough, forgotten enough for several lifetimes. My family built the Ashcroft territories on principles of alliance and mutual protection, and I choose to honor that legacy by choosing this, choosing him, choosing us." The mating ceremony took place under a full moon in forests that bordered both their territories, forests that would now be unified under their combined rule, and it was conducted according to traditions that predated written history, that required both participants in wolf form, that bound them through magic older than the council or territorial accords, or any political structure wolves had created. Winter's first full shift had happened 2 days prior under Evander's careful guidance and Meredith's supervision, the transformation agonizing in ways that transcended physical pain, bones reforming and fur sprouting, and her consciousness merging with the wolf that had been caged for 8 years. And when she finally stood on 4 legs for the first time in her remembered life, she understood why Whitlock had feared her bloodline enough to try destroying it completely. She was larger than normal female wolves, her fur silver so bright it seemed to glow in moonlight, her speed when she ran something that made Evander's own considerable pace look almost leisurely. And there was something else, something the old texts had called presence, the ability to project dominance in ways that went beyond physical strength, that made other wolves instinctively submit, not through fear but through recognition of inherent authority. Evander's wolf was massive and black and carried the golden eyes that marked him. "I am his alpha king." And when they ran together through forests silver with moonlight, Winter felt freedom she had forgotten was possible, felt joy that transcended language, felt the bond between them solidify into something that would outlast their physical forms. The private ceremony afterward in Evander's chambers was simpler, just the 2 of them and words that needed speaking without political witnesses or formal protocols. "I will never let anyone cage you again," Evander said, his hands gentle as they traced the scar around her wrist where the cuff had burned her for 8 years, a scar that Meredith said would fade with time, but that Winter had decided to keep, as reminder of what she had survived. "You are wild, you are fierce, you are mine only because you choose to be, and if you ever choose differently, I will let you go, even if it destroys me." Winter caught his hands, pressed them flat against her chest, where her heart beat steady and strong. "You gave me back myself," she said quietly. "You found me when I was lost.
You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. You held me through the worst pain I've experienced, and you never asked me to be anything except what I am. I choose you. I choose this. I choose us every day for as long as we both live." They made love with a tenderness that contradicted the violence they had survived together, with whispered promises and careful touches and the kind of vulnerability that came from trusting someone completely. And afterward, they lay tangled together, while moonlight painted patterns across skin, and Evander traced lazy circles on Winter's back, and they planned the future in quiet voices, planned reforms and alliances and the slow work of rebuilding what Whitlock had damaged. Bridget Keller accepted the position of head of the new Royal Guard, a unified force that would protect both territories and report directly to Winter and Evander, rather than through the political hierarchies that had allowed Whitlock to operate with impunity. Fletcher became joint advisor. His network of spies and informants expanded to include oversight of council activities, insurance against future corruption. Old Meredith revealed herself as the witch who had served the Ashcroft family for 40 years, who had watched over Winter throughout her captivity with magic subtle enough to avoid Whitlock's detection, who now served as official magical advisor, with authority to investigate any suspected abuse of supernatural power. 1 month after her restoration, Winter returned to Southport, to the Whitlock industrial factory that had been her prison, and stood in the courtyard while
Workers were assembled and given news of their freedom. Indenture contracts voided by royal decree. The entire system of forced labor declared illegal and punishable by the same imprisonment Whitlock now suffered. She watched faces transform from disbelief to hope to tears. Watched women she had worked beside for 8 years realize they could leave, could go home, could reclaim lives they had thought permanently lost. And she understood that this liberation of others who had suffered what she suffered, was justice more complete than Whitlock's imprisonment alone could provide. The factory she ordered transformed into housing for displaced workers, into training facilities for those who wanted to learn trades beyond textile work, into a symbol of what happened when power was wielded for protection rather than exploitation. The records of false indenture she burned personally, standing in the courtyard while Fletcher fed hundreds of files into a bonfire that burned hot enough to be seen from miles away, destroying the legal fictions that had kept so many trapped for so long. Winter stood in the alley where she had collapsed what felt like a lifetime ago, where Evander had found her and everything had changed. And she was not the same person who had fallen there weak and forgotten and utterly alone. She wore clothing that marked her as Luna Queen, as joint ruler of territories that spanned a quarter of their world, as someone who wielded power and authority and respect earned through survival. Evander stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, his presence solid and real and chosen every day. And she thought about the girl she had been, about the 8 years stolen, about the family murdered, about the rage and grief and trauma that would never fully disappear, but that she had learned to carry without being crushed beneath its weight. She had been erased, forgotten, caged, made into nothing by someone who feared what she represented. And now she was remembered. Now she was free. Now she was queen. And the empire that had tried to destroy her would never forget the name Ashcroft again, would never forget that silver wolves did not break easily, would never forget that some things once taken could be reclaimed through strength and stubbornness, and the absolute refusal to let cruelty have the final word. The future stretched before her, uncertain and challenging, and full of work that would take years. But she would face it with her mate beside her, with her wolf finally free, with her identity restored and her power reclaimed, and her choice, always her choice, to build something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed.